Marigold Briars had never imagined her skill with a pen could lead to such intrigue. As the lone calligrapher in Driftwood Dunes, a sleepy coastal community known for its quaint shops and endless swathes of golden sand, she had expected to spend her days creating decorative wedding invitations, personalizing guests' names on place cards, and occasionally teaching a workshop for novices. Instead, the request that landed on her desk this particular Wednesday morning was anything but ordinary. A local attorney, Mr. Waverley, had approached her with an unusual assignment: to transcribe and elegantly rewrite an antiquated legal contract. Intrigued by the rarity of the project, Marigold accepted, never suspecting it would usher her into a web of secrets that threatened the gentle tranquility of the town she'd grown to love. A stiff wind blew in from the ocean that morning, rattling the glass windows of Driftwood Dunes' Main Street shops. As she opened the envelope Mr. Waverley had dropped off, Marigold carefully removed the brittle papers inside. The contract, in nearly illegible cursive scrawl, appeared to date from several decades past. Certain sections looked water-damaged or blotched with ink, but the official seals and signature lines seemed intact. She smoothed her fingers across the textured parchment, checking the condition, and noted a swirling crest pressed into the margin. Anything more specific about its contents, however, was a puzzle thanks to the archaic script. Over a modest wooden desk that still bore traces of sand from customers' footprints, Marigold arranged her tools: a smooth fountain pen, fresh ink, and an array of nibs to accommodate different styles. Before beginning, she always spent a few minutes gazing out the shop's large bay window, letting the rhythmic hush of the ocean guide her into the calm state she needed to craft each elegant letter. The Dunes, as the locals called it, had a serene spirit. Its pastel cottages, seagrass-covered dunes, and weathered boardwalk exuded a timeless charm. If there was any place on earth that could soothe her busy mind or help her unravel a mystery, it was here on these shores. That day, however, a subtle sense of unease rattled her. She couldn't say precisely why, except that the old contract felt alive with hidden tension. Portions of the text were heavily distorted by blotches, as though the writer, or perhaps later readers, had tried to mask certain lines. The language itself was reminiscent of a formal property deed, discussing boundary lines and rightful claims. Yet the mention of a land trust and the repeated references to undisclosed parties caught her eye. Why would anyone hide the names of the actual owners? Questions swirled in her thoughts, but Marigold reminded herself that her job was technical: replicate the contract and restore its text to the best of her ability. This wasn't the first unusual inquiry that had come her way since she opened her calligraphy studio last year. Occasionally, amateurs who wanted to pass off a forgery or whimsical treasure map tried to enlist her skills. But Mr. Waverley was reputable, the town's collective fatherly attorney, beloved by older residents who trusted his warm smile. She had no reason to doubt him. Still, she internally resolved to handle the contract carefully and keep an eye on any peculiarities. As the afternoon sun began to dip, she set to work. She spent hours carefully deciphering the swirling script, transcribing each line word by word, references to property lines, partial payments, and the forging of partnerships. The contract was longer than she'd expected, and it included an addendum referencing a mysterious land transfer. Meticulous about her craft, Marigold paused frequently to check the older text and ensure she matched the flow of each swirl and curve precisely. In the early evening, hunger pangs reminded her it was time for dinner. Bidding goodbye to her cozy studio, she locked up and tucked the original documents in a secure cabinet behind her desk. She planned to bring them home to continue working, but after some hesitation she decided to leave the original contract in the shop's locked safe. This was no ordinary piece of parchment, and she was starting to suspect it could bring more trouble than she was prepared to handle alone. The next day she resumed her careful transcription. The lines referencing a developed area for expansion caught her eye, It outlined a scheme that seemed to shift ownership of prime coastal property from an unknown family to a newly formed company known as Driftwood Ventures. Old contracts often used archaic phrasing, but the cunningly ambiguous language in these sections raised the hairs on her neck. She recognized an attempt to hide something, masked behind the lofty legal phrases. In certain paragraphs, the original penman's strokes blurred or overlapped, as though the writer wanted to obscure the words. At midday, an unexpected visitor arrived at her studio, a short, robust man with slicked-back hair. He introduced himself as Herbert Smythe, a developer who claimed interest in the property referenced in this outdated contract. Marigold felt an immediate wariness around him. He wore an ingratiating smile that somehow seemed calculated. "I heard Mr. Waverley gave you some old documents to polish up," he said amiably, his gaze darting around for the contract. "I thought I might provide some historical context. After all, real estate is my business." She gave a polite smile. "Thank you for the offer, but Mr. Waverley didn't mention that I'd need additional information. I'm just making the text legible. That's all that's required, as far as I know." Of course, of course." Herbert's eyes drifted past her shoulders to where the contract lay in pieces on her desk. "But if you find yourself with questions, you can always come to me. I'm fairly well versed in these matters." She thanked him and watched him amble out, making sure to lock eyes with her one last time before stepping through the door. Soon as he left, she sat down, mind abuzz with questions. It was unusual for someone like Smythe to show interest in the transcription process. She decided it might be wise to share some of these peculiarities with her friend Dorothy Caldwell, the librarian at the Driftwood Dunes Public Library. Dorothy had a knack for digging up old records and had helped Marigold in the past with historical context for her calligraphy projects. That evening, Marigold wrapped up the half-finished transcriptions, slipped them into a folder, and headed to the library. The building was a charming relic of the town's Victorian heyday, with a sweeping front porch and intricate stained-glass windows. Inside, Dorothy was reorganizing a set of dusty tomes behind the reference desk. She greeted Marigold with her usual jolly warmth and poured them both cups of chamomile tea from a pot she kept on the counter. "What brings you to see me so late, Mary?" Dorothy asked, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of her nose. Marigold spread out her notes on a large polished table and explained what she'd seen in the crumbling contract. Dorothy listened intently, occasionally tweaking her glasses as she absorbed each detail. When Marigold reached the part about the apparently undisclosed family and the shady property transfer, Dorothy straightened. "That's definitely suspicious," she murmured. "Let me check the older records for you. We have archives from real estate transactions going back decades. Maybe we can figure out who originally owned that piece of property and see if there's a known scandal attached." She rummaged behind the reference desk and returned lugging 2 massive binders. They spent an hour flipping through pages of land transactions, scanning for any mention of Driftwood Ventures or families displaced by suspicious deals. Finally, Dorothy let out a triumphant gasp. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry from the 1970s. "I see a notation about a large property near the beach that changed hands abruptly. It belonged to a local fisherman's family, the Crawfords. According to this, Clyde Crawford was forced to sign over the land to a development group called, yes, here it is, Driftwood Ventures. But the interesting part is that after the deal, the developer never moved forward with any construction. The project fell through, or so it reads." She glanced up at Marigold. "No reason is given, but it all happened suspiciously fast." Marigold felt her heart flutter. So that might be the same property this contract concerns. And if so, the contract might detail exactly how that land was taken. Dorothy nodded. "It might. And there's this small note about controversy surrounding the sale. Something about intimidation and misrepresented terms." She closed the binder gently, as though it were made of glass. "I never heard word of that from my grandparents. But maybe it was one of those hush-hush local stories that never made it out to town gossip." The thought that she was transcribing a document that might detail a coerced and potentially unethical takeover chilled Marigold. Yet it also drew her with an irresistible sense of duty. If the contract's text revealed some hidden wrongdoing, didn't the rightful heirs deserve justice? She didn't want to meddle in legal affairs beyond her expertise, but she hated the notion of leaving unfairness in the dark. Over the next several days, she focused intently on completing the transcript. Mr. Waverley stopped by to check her progress and offered a grateful nod. He mentioned that an unnamed client had asked him to confirm the contract's authenticity. At that point, Marigold debated whether to share her suspicions with him, but she wasn't entirely sure where his loyalties lay. In a small town, allegiances could become tangled, and she didn't want to accuse him of anything prematurely. Meanwhile, Herbert Smythe paid her another impromptu visit, dropping by under the guise of respecting her artistry. Only this time he offered thinly veiled hints that finishing the contract quickly and leaving out unnecessary details would be beneficial for everyone involved. The subtext was unmistakable. Herbert knew the contract contained damning information. He wanted to ensure that Marigold or anyone else wouldn't publicize it. She politely insisted she was simply transcribing what was written. Late one evening, after finishing another section of the text, she carefully compared the contract's final sections to earlier statements. That's when she detected a crucial piece of evidence. The property's rightful claimants were never officially compensated. Instead, the contract included a confusing chain of ownership that made it look as though the family voluntarily sold the land for a fair price, but the appended signatures suspiciously matched each other, indicating they might have been penned by the same person. And the name used to sign for the Crawfords was suspiciously scrawled in a different style, reminiscent of the developer's signature found in other sections. The contract apparently hid a forgery, or at least some unscrupulous trick to ensure the land shifted into wrong hands. She nearly spilled her cup of herbal tea upon realizing it. The forged signatures were shockingly blatant once you compared them to the early portion of the text. In her line of work, studying every swirl and curve of a pen stroke gave her a discerning eye. She could see one person had penned both sets of signatures. The revelation sent shivers down her spine. Marigold felt she had to tell someone. Dorothy was her first choice, but this discovery felt bigger than both of them. Yet if she confronted Herbert Smythe, she risked tipping him off. And if she went to Mr. Waverley, what if he was protecting his client's interests rather than seeking the truth? The following day, the situation escalated. She arrived at her shop to find her locked safe jimmied open and the original contract gone. Panic rose in her chest. Who would dare rob a small-town calligrapher's studio? She called the police, who arrived promptly. Sergeant Ricardo Delgado and Officer Marie Perkins, who had known Marigold since her earliest days in the dunes. They did a quick inspection, took statements, and promised to investigate. Marigold explained how vital the contract was, but refrained from going into detail about the unscrupulous forgery. She wanted to keep that information close until she knew who could be trusted. After the police left, Marigold sat in stunned silence. This job, which she'd initially taken on as a routine transcription, had turned into a full-blown crime scenario. Thankfully, she still had her partial transcripts and her notes on the suspicious details. Even though the culprit stole the original, the secrets remained at least partially in her possession. But who would have taken the contract? She suspected Smythe, but if Mr. Waverley's unnamed client had an interest in burying the truth, maybe it wasn't Smythe alone. Alternatively, perhaps the rightful owners had tried to retrieve it, to protect it from meddling forces. There was only one real way forward: find out who ended up with that property after the fiasco and see if they were the ones behind the burglary. "Dorothy," Marigold said into her phone that afternoon, "I need your help again. It's about the stolen contract." She explained the break-in and her suspicions. Dorothy offered to meet her at the library, where they could comb through more records in a safe place. This time, Marigold arrived armed with her partial transcripts, ready to match them against official county files. She wanted to see if the final recorded deed matched the contract's language. They found the official record of the property transfer. The deed was filed with the county under the name of an entity called Shoreline Development Group. Oddly enough, Shoreline was a subsidiary of Driftwood Ventures, which in turn had an ownership stake that tied back to none other than Herbert Smythe. So it all funneled back to him. Even though the acquisition was decades old, a chain of smaller companies had evidently been used to hide Smythe's involvement. The question now was what the unscrupulous developer might plan to do with that land. Driftwood Dunes had grown more popular in recent years, with tourists flocking to the nearby beaches. If someone unmasked the forgery, Smythe risked losing a valuable piece of real estate that could be turned into luxury condos. Dorothy's gaze was serious when she finally looked up from the records. "You know, Mari, he must want to keep the contract hidden at all costs. If it's proven to be forged, the rightful owners or their heirs could challenge his claim in court." She gestured to the partial transcripts. "We have the evidence right here, enough to raise serious questions." "You're right, but the original is gone now. I only have my notes. Will that be enough proof?" She spoke quietly, a note of determination in her voice. "We need to find an expert who can verify the forgery. I know a retired forensic document examiner living in the next county. He visits the library from time to time, always checking out old manuscripts on penmanship." Marigold felt some relief. "That would be perfect. But how do we keep it safe in the meantime?" Dorothy gave a confident nod. "Leave it to me. The library has a secure archive room. We can lock the transcripts there, then I'll call him to look at them as soon as he's available." Though they devised a plan. Dorothy would store the transcripts under lock and key in the library. Marigold would make a separate copy of her notes to keep hidden at her house. As an added precaution, she scanned the transcripts onto a secure thumb drive, which she then tucked into a sealed envelope. Even if the thieves tried to grab all physical evidence, they wouldn't get the digital backup. Early the next morning, Sergeant Delgado called. "We've received a tip about your missing contract," he said, voice crackling over the line. "A fisherman down by the docks saw a rolled parchment tossed into the harbour. He recovered it, but it's severely water-damaged. I need you to come down and see if it's the same one." Her heart pounded. "I'll be right there." She dashed to the police station, and sure enough, behind Delgado's desk sat a plastic evidence bag containing a sodden roll of parchment. She could still make out that swirling crest in the corner. It was the same document. The writing was nearly ruined. Ink smeared and blotched beyond recognition. Whoever stole it decided to destroy the evidence once they realized it might incriminate them. Marigold gently touched the evidence bag. Sadness mingled with anger. Through her craft, she'd slowly come to decipher the concealed secrets of this contract. To see it so casually ruined made her stomach churn. This was more than just a piece of paper. It spoke to an injustice that had likely devastated a local family. Delgado shook his head sympathetically. "We have a few leads on who might have done it," he said. "That fisherman said he saw a tall figure wearing a hood toss something off the pier around midnight. He couldn't get a good look at the face, though." The sergeant sighed. "In a small town, it's tough to keep secrets. We'll figure this out." She thanked him and left, newly determined not to let that original contract's destruction hamper her efforts. The transcripts were intact. She would make sure the truth came out, even if doing so meant crossing an influential figure like Herbert Smythe. Later that afternoon, Dorothy called with news. The forensic document examiner, Mr. Caldwell, no relation to Dorothy, purely coincidence, had reviewed the transcripts and her notes on the handwriting. He agreed the final signatures were indeed penned by the same hand that signed the developer's name. "That alone is enough to raise serious legal questions," Dorothy explained with excitement. "He says if the rightful heirs of the property ever wanted to challenge the ownership, they could present this evidence in court." Marigold closed her eyes, relief washing over her. "That's fantastic news," she said softly. But she opened them again as her mind navigated the practicalities. "And the family's name?" "The Crawfords." "Do we know if any of them still live in Driftwood Dunes?" Dorothy tapped her pen, flipping through a well-worn phone directory for the county. "I see a listing for an Eliza Crawford in the next town over. Saltshore. She might be related." Without hesitation, Dorothy placed a call. Marigold paced quietly, her nerves on edge, waiting. After a few rings, Dorothy began speaking to a soft-voiced woman on the other end. Her expression shifted to compassion. "Yes, I see," she said, scribbling a note. "I understand." A pause. "I'm so sorry for what your family went through." "Yes, we would be happy to help." Another pause, and then Dorothy fumbled the receiver slightly before turning to Marigold, with tears shimmering in her eyes. "She wants to meet us," Dorothy said, "at her mother's old cottage in Saltshore tomorrow morning." Marigold exhaled. "Then let's do it." This was their chance to restore something that had been taken so unfairly, and though she recognized that her involvement had escalated well beyond a straightforward calligraphy job, she felt it was the right thing to do. She owed it to Eliza and her family to set the record straight. The next day they travelled a short distance to Saltshore, discovering a quaint, shabby cottage perched near rocky tidal pools. Eliza greeted them at the door with a tired smile and led them into a cosy sitting room. An old photograph of a man in fishing gear sat in a worn frame on the mantel. "My grandfather, Clyde Crawford," Eliza said softly. "Growing up, all I knew was he lost everything to some shady land deal. The story was always hush-hush, like a source of shame or heartbreak. But I always suspected it wasn't as fair as the official paperwork claimed." Dorothy explained the chain of events, how the contract had come to Marigold for transcription, how certain anomalies suggested a forgery, and how the stolen original had been destroyed. They showed her the partial transcripts and the analysis from Mr. Caldwell. Eliza's eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and renewed sorrow. "So we weren't crazy," she murmured. "All these years we believed our family was cheated, but we never had proof." Marigold placed a comforting hand on Eliza's arm. "You do now, or at least enough to demand an official investigation. If you'd like, I can help you contact a lawyer to file an inquiry into the property's ownership." Nearby, Dorothy chimed in. "We can also talk to Sergeant Delgado. He's a fair man, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to see justice rightfully served." Eliza drew a deep breath, shoulders trembling. "Yes, I appreciate that. I'm going to fight this. My mother passed away believing our family's land was taken by legitimate means. Now maybe I can restore our name and correct this wrong." In the following days the story began to spread through the close-knit community. Enough whispers reached Herbert Smythe's ears that he made one last attempt to pay Marigold a visit. This time, however, he wasn't calm and smiling, he was fidgety, his voice raised. "Why are you meddling in things that you don't understand?" he barked, having cornered Marigold near the pastry counter of the local bakery. "You're just a calligrapher. You don't know how real estate works." Her voice wavered, but she held her ground. "As a calligrapher, I can tell a fake signature when I see one," she said, lifting her chin. "That's enough for me to understand plenty." Smythe's eyes blazed, but he must have realized the town's disapproving stares were trained on him. The bakery owner, an elderly woman with a protective spirit, shuffled closer, ready to intervene if needed. Cowed by the watchful crowd, Smythe mumbled under his breath about consequences and stormed out, slamming the bakery's door. Word travelled fast. Smythe's public outburst, a shocking display in an otherwise peaceful town, only put more suspicion on him. Soon, Sergeant Delgado was questioning Smythe, and Mr. Waverley was verifying the timeline of events. At last, faced with mounting evidence, the developer caved. He admitted that the contract was indeed forged years ago, orchestrated by his father's generation to obtain prime seaside property at a fraction of its worth. The stolen document had been a desperate attempt to bury the truth, but these new transcripts had exposed the wrongdoing anyway. By the end of the week, Eliza had initiated the process to reclaim her family's land, with help from a legitimate lawyer. Smythe and his associates faced a daunting legal battle. Marigold couldn't help feeling a twinge of pride. Though she'd never thought her artistic skill would have such real-world impact, she was grateful she'd had the courage to follow her intuition. In a small ceremony, she delivered a fresh copy of the transcribed contract to Eliza. Each letter glowed with careful strokes of black ink on crisp new parchment. A local news reporter snapped a photograph of Marigold and Eliza shaking hands, a moment of both closure and new beginnings for the Crawford family. That evening, Marigold returned to her studio. The door chimes tinkled as she entered. Moonlight poured through the wide glass window, casting a gentle glow on her desk. She unrolled another sheet of fine parchment, intending to start on a completely different commission, an ornate wedding invitation for a local couple preparing to marry by the dunes. For a moment, her hand hovered over the page, images of everything that had happened drifting through her mind like sea mist. She remembered the first time she'd held that old, cryptic contract. She remembered the faint sense of unease, the initial hunch that something about its swirling text was off. As she laid down the first pencil guidelines for her new project, she realized just how powerful the written word could be. Like the tide, it held the ability to erode entire foundations, or, with the right guidance, to heal deep wounds that had festered for decades. She continued drawing smooth, curving lines, her movements guided by a renewed sense of purpose. No longer did she doubt the value of her craft. It was more than typography for pretty wedding invites. It was a gateway to truth and art form that demanded honesty, precision, and a light hand. She could feel the hush of the night enveloping her, and a small smile graced her face. Somewhere out there, a family was finding justice because of her willingness to transcribe the past without turning a blind eye to its hidden secrets. In the weeks that followed, the scandal made a few headlines in the local paper, though it was handled quietly enough to preserve the serenity of Driftwood Dunes. The library's archives gained improved security, Dorothy having convinced local officials that older documents needed better protection to prevent future mischief. Mr. Waverley, upon learning the full scope, issued a statement, apologizing for not verifying the contract's authenticity sooner, no longer the beloved fatherly attorney, but a humbled figure who claimed ignorance of the shady dealings. As for Herbert Smythe, his public reputation lay in shambles, and the courts would decide his fate. Meanwhile, Eliza Crawford continued the lengthy legal process with determination, holding Marigold's impeccable calligraphy as proof of the forgery. Each swirl, flourish, and signature was meticulously recorded, shining light on a wrongdoing long hidden in darkness. When at last the legal dust settled, Marigold found herself back at her studio's bay window, watching afternoon light paint the waves golden. She sipped her tea, reflecting on how drastically her quiet life had changed from the moment she'd decided to accept that unusual contract. Yet she felt at peace, grateful that her craft had played a vital role in righting a wrong. In the end, Driftwood Dunes returned to its easygoing normalcy, the call of the gulls, the clink of seashell wind chimes, and the hush of sand shifting underfoot. And though Marigold might soon be back to her routine of wedding invitations and name inscriptions, she wouldn't forget the lessons she'd gleaned. Every word mattered. Every penstroke had the power to echo across time, leaving its mark on the world. Now, she took extra care whenever she shaped her letters, infusing each curve with a subtle confidence. Because even the most gentle, humble craft might one day reveal the secrets in a hidden contract, and maybe even save a seaside town from losing its soul in the process.